If a creature has no claws, no fangs, no venom, and no natural armor, Professor Lyra Voss said as she looked across the packed auditorium, then it has only two choices: hide or become someone else's meal. Laughter rolled through the massive lecture hall like a passing wave. Hundreds of students from every corner of known space nodded in agreement while a towering hologram of a human slowly rotated above the center stage. The image looked almost embarrassingly ordinary. 2 arms, 2 legs, smooth skin, no scales, no protective shell, no visible weapons. A small line of text appeared beneath the model. Terran. Homeworld, Earth. Classification, fragile omnivore. Professor Voss folded her hands behind her back. Observe the hands. No talons. Observe the mouth. Flat teeth designed for mixed diets. No venom glands. No reinforced bone plating. Their muscle density ranks below more than 70% of known predator species. She paused, allowing the silence to settle. Now ask yourselves the simplest question in evolutionary biology. How did this species survive? Another student raised 4 slender fingers. Professor, wasn't humanity protected by stronger civilizations after entering galactic society? Correct, Lyra answered. Had they emerged a few thousand years earlier, they likely would have disappeared long before first contact. More laughter followed. Even the guest researchers smiled politely. Humanity was always used as the textbook example of improbable survival, not because humans were exceptional, but because they appeared statistically impossible. Lyra tapped the floating display again. A comparison chart filled the room. Razor claws, acid spit, neurotoxins, camouflage organs, electromagnetic senses. Every apex predator in the galaxy possessed at least several biological advantages. Humans had none. Evolution rewards efficiency, she continued. Nature does not hand victories to the weakest animal in the forest. A student near the front leaned forward. Then why do some military reports classify humans as dangerous? Lyra smiled patiently. Politics, reputation. Stories spread faster than evidence. The audience murmured in agreement. Fear, she added, is not data. Before she could continue, every light inside the auditorium dimmed. The holograms vanished. Conversation stopped instantly as a low emergency tone echoed across the chamber. One enormous display replaced every screen in the building. Priority, transmission. Galactic Expedition Authority. The room became silent. A calm synthetic voice filled the hall. Research Expedition 9 has failed to report for 73 standard hours following deployment to Khepra 4. Automated beacons remain active. Biological status of personnel unknown. A rotating image of a dark green world appeared, wrapped in endless forests and violent weather systems. Beneath it flashed one classification in bright crimson letters. Death World. Students exchanged uneasy looks. Even Lyra's confident posture stiffened. Khepra 4 was not used for classroom examples. It was where expeditions quietly disappeared. The report continued. Due to environmental complexity, the Galactic Science Council has accepted assistance from the Terran Alliance. A few students chuckled. Someone whispered, "They're sending volunteers." Another answered, "Probably a rescue team." The next line erased every smile in the room. Terran deployment confirmed. Personnel assigned, 1. Confused voices spread through the auditorium. 1. That's impossible. A data error? Lyra narrowed her eyes. Display the operative. The screen shifted to a personnel file. A man in a faded brown field jacket looked directly into the camera with a relaxed expression. 40 years old. Short brown hair beginning to gray at the temples. Weathered face. No medals displayed. No intimidating armor. Just a plain insulated backpack slung over one shoulder and a stainless steel travel mug in his hand. Name, Dr. Mason Brooks. Occupation, survival specialist. A student blinked in disbelief. That's it. Another laughed. He's bringing coffee to a death world? The room erupted again, but this time Lyra did not join them. She kept staring at the quiet man on the screen. There was something deeply unsettling about the expression on his face. Not confidence, not arrogance, just the calm look of someone who believed he already understood what everyone else had failed to notice. The transport shuttle touched down with barely a sound, its landing struts settling into the damp black soil as sheets of rain drifted across the clearing. The hatch lowered, and every member of the waiting alien expedition expected someone larger, louder, or at least dressed like a soldier. Instead, Dr. Mason Brooks stepped out carrying a weathered backpack over one shoulder and a stainless steel travel mug in his right hand. He paused long enough to stretch his back before looking up at the endless wall of emerald trees surrounding the landing zone. "Well," he said with an easy smile, "that looks welcoming." Nobody laughed. Professor Lyra Voss studied him from several yards away. The personnel file had not exaggerated his appearance. He was painfully average. About 6 feet tall, broad shoulders earned from years of physical work rather than a laboratory, hiking boots stained with old mud, and a faded brown jacket that had clearly seen more seasons than regulations allowed. There was no advanced combat suit, no exotic equipment, no visible weapons beyond a small utility knife clipped inside his belt. "Dr. Brooks?" Lyra asked. Mason turned toward her. "That is me. You traveled alone?" "Looks that way. There are no additional Terran specialists arriving?" Mason took a sip from his coffee before answering. "No, ma'am." Several members of the science team exchanged puzzled glances. One of the reptilian researchers quietly muttered, "Perhaps the humans misunderstood the severity of the assignment." Another replied just loudly enough to be heard. Or perhaps they simply could not spare anyone more qualified. Mason showed no sign that he had heard either comment. Instead, he crouched near the edge of the clearing, scooped a handful of damp soil into his palm, rubbed it between his fingers, then smelled it for a second before letting it fall back to the ground. Lyra frowned. "What exactly are you doing?" "Getting introduced." She blinked. "To the dirt." "Everything starts with the dirt." The answer sounded so ordinary that nobody knew how to respond. One of the expedition officers activated a floating scanner that immediately surrounded Mason with blue light. Lines of biological data scrolled across the display. Skeletal density, muscle mass, heart rate, oxygen saturation, adrenal response. Every result appeared perfectly unremarkable. Finally, the system produced its conclusion. Biological threat assessment, minimal. The officer nodded with visible satisfaction. The analysis confirms the Academy's models. Mason glanced at the screen and shrugged. "If that thing makes you feel better, keep using it." Lyra crossed her arms. "You disagree with our instruments?" "Not really." He smiled politely. "I just would not bet my life on one." Before anyone could question him further, Mason slowly removed the lid from his coffee mug and took another drink while staring toward the dense tree line. His relaxed expression faded almost imperceptibly. The conversation behind him continued, but he no longer seemed interested in it. His eyes followed the movement of leaves nearly 100 yards away where the wind appeared to shift against the natural direction of the storm. He listened for several seconds before quietly asking, "How long have your generators been running?" The lead engineer looked surprised. "Approximately 11 hours. Mason nodded once. "Thought so." Lyra stepped closer. "Why does that matter?" Mason looked back at the group. "Because if I can smell warm machinery through all this rain from here, something else probably can too." The clearing fell silent. Several researchers instinctively glanced toward the dark forest. The scanners reported nothing unusual. No large life forms. No approaching movement. Just rain, trees, and empty wilderness. One young student gave an awkward laugh. "You really believe something is watching us?" Mason slipped the lid back onto his mug and adjusted the strap of his backpack. "No," he answered calmly. "I never believe." He looked toward the forest one more time. "I just pay attention." The expedition left the landing zone just after sunrise, although the thick canopy swallowed so much light that it still felt like early dawn. Moisture clung to every branch, and the air carried the earthy scent of wet moss and ancient wood. Hovering drones floated several feet above the trail, projecting blue grids across the landscape, while environmental scanners quietly mapped every inch ahead. Lieutenant Soren, the expedition's security coordinator, studied the display on his wrist. No large organisms within 1,000 feet. Atmospheric conditions remain stable. Path Alpha is completely clear. Several researchers nodded with visible relief. Professor Lyra Voss looked toward Mason. "The survey drones have already selected the safest route to the missing research station." Mason remained still for another moment, listening. He looked up through the trees instead of at the scanners. Somewhere above them, birds had stopped calling. The silence settled naturally over the forest, but to him it felt misplaced. I would rather head west, he said. Soren frowned. West? Mason pointed through a stretch of dense ferns. About 300 yards that way. The lieutenant glanced at his display and shook his head. Negative. That area contains unstable terrain and thicker vegetation. The computer predicts a 37% increase in travel time. Mason smiled politely. Sometimes slower gets you there faster. One of the younger xenobiologists quietly laughed. That sounds like something printed on a coffee mug. Mason looked down at the stainless steel cup still clipped to his backpack. Would not surprise me. A few members of the team chuckled, but Lyra kept studying him. Dr. Brooks, she asked, what evidence supports changing our route? Mason glanced across the trees. Nothing I can measure. Soren folded his arms. Then your recommendation is based on intuition? Experience, Mason corrected gently. There is a difference. The lieutenant turned back toward the group. We will continue on Path Alpha. Our instruments are considerably more reliable than instinct. Nobody objected. The drones accelerated, marking the approved trail with floating navigation lights. The team followed in organized formation, while Mason quietly moved toward the back without another word. Nearly 20 minutes passed. The forest remained strangely peaceful. Scanner reports continued, showing minimal environmental risk. Every few minutes, another notification appeared across Soren's display. No significant threat detected. One of the graduate researchers smiled. Perhaps the stories about this planet have been exaggerated. Another added, fear tends to grow with distance. Mason kept walking, occasionally glancing at the ground instead of the trees. Fresh impressions marked patches of damp soil before disappearing beneath tangled roots. He noticed snapped branches several feet above eye level and deep scratches running across the bark of a fallen trunk. None of it matched the digital terrain maps. He finally stopped beside a cluster of broad green leaves. Hold up. The front of the group continued another 20 feet before realizing he was no longer following. Lyra turned around. What is it? Mason crouched beside the trail. Take a look. Several researchers gathered around him. They stared at the forest floor without understanding what he wanted them to see. I do not see anything, one admitted. Mason pointed toward a narrow strip of flattened vegetation. Exactly. They looked more closely. The plants formed a smooth corridor cutting through the undergrowth, almost invisible unless viewed from ground level. Soren checked his scanner. No biological activity. Mason nodded. I believe that. The lieutenant raised an eyebrow. You do? Sure. Mason stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. Whatever made this trail is not here anymore. One of the students exhaled in relief. Then we are fine. Mason looked at him for a long second before answering in the same calm voice he had used since arriving. Maybe. His eyes drifted toward the silent forest again. Or maybe we are walking exactly where something expects us to be. The trail narrowed until even the hovering drones struggled to weave between the towering trunks. Thick vines hung overhead like old ropes, dripping with rainwater that landed in slow, steady drops against the leaves below. Every few minutes the navigation system announced another reassuring update. Course remains optimal. Environmental hazards remain low. Lieutenant Soren seemed pleased. There, he said with a satisfied smile. The algorithms have yet to disappoint us. Mason glanced toward the dark forest without slowing his pace. Nature does not read algorithms. Before Soren could answer, a sharp electronic chirp broke the silence. One of the forward drones had stopped moving. Its blue navigation lights flickered once before the display dissolved into static. Then the drone simply dropped into the ferns with a dull thud. Another alert sounded. A second drone disappeared from the tactical map. Signal interference, one technician said as he adjusted his wrist console. Attempting reboot. Nothing happened. A third drone vanished. Then a fourth. Lyra looked up. What is causing that? The technician shook his head. There is no detectable electromagnetic field. No radiation spike. No atmospheric disturbance. Mason quietly stepped off the main trail and looked toward the trees where the drones had disappeared. Do not go after them. Soren frowned. They are expensive survey units. Buy new ones. Mason answered without taking his eyes off the forest. You cannot replace people. The lieutenant hesitated only a second before waving two security officers forward anyway. Recover the equipment. The pair walked less than 30 feet into the brush before one of them called back. We found one. A second later his voice changed. Wait, this is strange. Everyone instinctively looked toward him. The officer emerged holding the drone in both hands. There was no visible damage. No dents. No broken parts. The machine looked almost brand new. It simply shut off, he said. The technician hurried over, connected a portable diagnostic tool, and frowned. Impossible. What? Lyra asked. The memory is empty. Corrupted? No. He looked genuinely confused. Empty. As if it had never recorded a single second. The team exchanged uneasy glances. These drones continuously backed up data through 3 separate storage systems. Losing everything was nearly impossible. Mason slowly walked over, examined the drone for only a moment, then handed it back. Let us keep moving. Soren looked irritated. Dr. Brooks, you seem remarkably unconcerned. Mason shrugged. Machines fail. You think that is all this is? Mason looked directly at him. No. The simple answer lingered in the damp air. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Finally, Lyra broke the silence. Then what do you think is happening? Mason adjusted the strap on his backpack. Something out here noticed us before we noticed it. One of the graduate researchers laughed nervously. Based on what evidence? Mason pointed toward the forest canopy. Listen. They all stopped. Rain continued falling. Leaves shifted gently in the breeze. Water trickled over rocks. But beneath those familiar sounds something was missing. The insects had gone silent. The birds had disappeared. Even the small tree mammals they had seen earlier were nowhere in sight. Lyra slowly turned in a full circle. I did not notice that. Mason nodded. Most people do not. He spoke so calmly, it almost sounded like an ordinary conversation between neighbors. Animals usually tell you what is happening long before your eyes can. Soren glanced down at his scanner again. The display remained unchanged. No threat detected. He looked back toward the empty woods, then at the silent treetops, and for the first time since landing, he did not entirely trust the glowing screen attached to his wrist. Mason noticed the hesitation and gave him a small, understanding smile. Congratulations, he said softly. You just started paying attention instead of looking. The expedition slowed to a cautious walk, not because the terrain had become more difficult, but because uncertainty had quietly replaced confidence. Lieutenant Soren no longer marched at the front with his eyes fixed on the tactical display. Every few steps, he found himself glancing into the trees the way Mason had been doing since they landed. Professor Lyra noticed the change immediately. You have checked that scanner 6 times in the last minute, she said. Soren forced a smile. Habit. Mason shook his head gently. No. Doubt. Nobody argued. The trail curved around a shallow stream no wider than 4 feet. Crystal clear water flowed over smooth black stones, untouched by any sign of pollution. Mason stopped beside it without saying a word. He knelt, watching the current drift past a fallen branch. The others waited impatiently. One graduate researcher sighed. Dr. Brooks, we are losing valuable time. Mason pointed at the water. Take a look. They stepped closer. At first nothing seemed unusual. Then Lyra noticed it. There are no fish. Mason nodded. No insects either. Another researcher frowned. Perhaps this stream simply cannot support aquatic life. Mason smiled. Maybe. He picked up a small pebble and dropped it into the current. Tiny ripples spread across the surface. Nothing moved beneath them. Back home, he said, my grandfather taught me something when I was about 8 years old. If a creek looks perfect but nothing is living in it, do not assume it is safe. Assume everything else knows something you do not. Lyra looked at him with genuine curiosity. Your scientific training began with your grandfather? Mason laughed quietly. My scientific training started long before college. It started with fishing trips, camping, fixing fences, getting caught in storms, and making enough mistakes to remember them. One of the younger students tilted his head. That does not sound like science. Mason stood and adjusted his backpack. It depends how you define science. He looked around at the silent forest. Observation, pattern recognition, testing assumptions, learning from failure. He smiled again. Sounds familiar to me. The words lingered with Lyra as they resumed walking. Every lesson she had ever taught relied on measurable biological traits. Claws, venom, muscle density, neural speed. Everything could be categorized, compared, and ranked. Yet this human continued making accurate observations using almost none of the instruments the Academy considered essential. After another 15 minutes, the trees opened into a broad clearing. At its center stood the remains of the missing expedition's temporary observation camp. Portable shelters remained standing. Supply containers were neatly stacked exactly where they had been unloaded. Solar panels still tracked the gray sky overhead. Nothing looked damaged. "This cannot be right," Soren whispered. "The emergency beacon originated here." Several researchers hurried toward the equipment. Every crate appeared untouched. Field computers rested neatly on folding tables. Half-finished mugs sat beside open notebooks as though someone had simply stepped away for lunch. One researcher picked up a tablet. "The battery is still charged." Another called out, "Medical supplies untouched." Lyra slowly turned in place. "Where is everyone?" No one answered. Mason did not approach the camp immediately. Instead, he remained at the edge of the clearing, studying the surrounding tree line. His expression had become noticeably more serious. Lyra walked over. "What do you see?" Mason answered without looking at her. "I think we have been asking the wrong question." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He finally met her eyes. "Everyone keeps asking where the missing team went." He paused for a moment before quietly adding, "I think we should be asking why they chose to leave everything behind." No one touched anything for several long seconds. The abandoned camp felt wrong in ways that no scanner could explain. Every chair remained upright. Every storage case was latched. A portable stove still held a sealed kettle filled with rainwater. It looked less like a disaster site and more like someone had stepped away with every intention of returning. Lieutenant Soren finally broke the silence. "Spread out in pairs. Search every shelter. Stay within visual range." The team immediately moved into action. Mason did not. He stood quietly beside the nearest tent, looking down instead of around. Lyra noticed and walked over. "You are searching the ground again." "Always." "Why?" Mason pointed toward the damp soil outside the entrance. "Because people lie." Lyra looked confused. "People? Tracks do not." She followed his finger. At first, all she saw were dozens of overlapping footprints pressed into the soft earth. Then Mason crouched and traced one narrow line with his finger. "These belong to your missing scientists." He moved a few inches farther. "These belong to your cargo crew." Then he pointed toward another set. "And these," he paused, "are interesting." Lyra leaned closer. "I cannot tell the difference." Mason smiled. "Most people cannot. Different stride, different weight distribution. Whoever made these spent years walking rough ground." She studied the impressions again, but still saw only mud. "You can really tell all of that. Enough to know they do not belong here." Soren approached after finishing his sweep of the command shelter. "Nothing. No signs of struggle?" Mason asked. "None." "Emergency messages?" "Nothing." "Damaged equipment?" "Everything works." Mason slowly nodded, as though the answers confirmed something he had already suspected. One of the technicians hurried across the clearing holding a portable recorder. "Professor, I recovered this from the communications desk." Lyra accepted the device and activated its playback. Static crackled for several seconds before a nervous voice emerged. "Day 12. Environmental readings remain normal." The recording skipped. "Still cannot explain why local wildlife keeps changing direction before sunset." More static followed. "Dr. Helen says we are imagining patterns." Another pause. Then the final sentence arrived, spoken much more quietly. "I think something is studying us." The recording ended. Nobody spoke. Soren reached for another explanation. "Stress. Isolation. Fatigue." Mason looked toward the surrounding forest. "Maybe." The technician frowned. "There should be more files. This recorder stores months of data." He checked the memory again before looking up. "Everything after this entry has been erased." Lyra folded her arms tightly. "Just like the drones." Mason nodded once. "Yes." She stared at him. "You sound like you expected that." "Not expected." He took a slow breath. "Recognized." Lyra followed his gaze into the trees. "Recognized from where?" Mason remained quiet for a moment before answering. "When I was a kid, my father used to tell me something before every camping trip." A faint smile crossed his face. He would say, "The loudest place in the woods is the one that wants you to relax. The quiet place is the one asking whether you belong there." The breeze drifted through the clearing, barely moving the tops of the grass. Even now the silence felt unnaturally complete. No birds, no insects, no distant calls from unseen animals. only the soft hum of the expedition's equipment. Mason suddenly looked toward the northern tree line. Turn that generator off. Soren frowned. Why? Because it is the loudest thing within a mile. It powers our communications. Mason met his eyes. And it tells everything out there exactly where we are. Soren hesitated. For the first time since joining the mission, he did not immediately trust his own judgment over the humans. After a long pause, he reached for the control panel and shut the generator down. The steady mechanical hum disappeared. Complete silence settled over the clearing. Then, almost 30 seconds later, somewhere deep beyond the trees, a single bird finally began to sing again. Mason looked at Lyra without the slightest trace of triumph. That, he said softly, is the first good news we have had all day. Professor Lyra Voss could not stop thinking about the bird. One small sound had changed everything she believed about the forest around them. For the first time in her career, the most valuable piece of information had not come from a scanner, a laboratory, or a database. It had come from a man holding a travel mug. She watched Mason kneel beside the extinguished generator, brushing a few wet leaves over its metal housing until it blended naturally into the ground. Why are you covering it? She asked. Because the forest remembers shapes that do not belong. Lyra looked around the clearing. You speak as though this place is alive. Mason smiled. Every forest is alive. He stood and slowly scanned the tree line again. The question is whether it notices you. Lieutenant Soren approached, carrying the tactical display. Communications are weaker without the generator, but we still have emergency reserves. Mason nodded. Good. Leave the rest off. One of the engineers looked uneasy. We are reducing our own advantages. Mason shook his head. No, we are reducing our noise. The young engineer frowned. Those are different things. Sometimes, Mason replied. Sometimes they are exactly the same. The team gathered around a folding table inside the command shelter. Digital terrain maps filled the surface while researchers debated possible explanations for the missing expedition. Equipment failure, psychological stress, unknown environmental toxins. Every theory relied on measurable variables. Mason quietly listened without interrupting until Lyra finally looked at him. What do you think happened? He studied the map for a few seconds before answering. I think they kept treating this planet like a puzzle. And I think they forgot it was a place. The room fell silent. One researcher leaned forward. I do not understand the difference. Mason rested both hands on the table. A puzzle waits for you to solve it. A place does not care whether you understand it. He pointed toward the marked survey routes. You came here asking how to survive this world. His finger moved to the untouched sections beyond the camp. You should have asked how everything else survives here first. Lyra slowly replayed those words in her mind. Every lesson she had taught placed intelligent observers above the environments they studied. Humanity seemed to reverse that order completely. Before anyone could continue, a soft breeze drifted through the open shelter. Mason immediately stopped talking. His eyes shifted toward the entrance. Do not move. Everyone froze. What is it? Soren whispered. Mason lifted one finger, asking for silence. 5 long seconds passed. Then 10. Finally, he relaxed. We are fine. Several people released nervous breaths. One student looked confused. What changed? Mason answered matter-of-factly. The wind. The wind. It was blowing toward the north all morning. He pointed toward the doorway. Now it is coming from the west. The student shrugged. Weather changes. Yes. Mason picked up a handful of loose dirt from the floor and let it fall. The tiny particles drifted gently through the doorway. Which means our scent is traveling somewhere different now. Lyra stared at him. You track the wind every minute. Mason looked genuinely surprised by the question. Does everybody else not? Nobody answered. The silence itself became the answer. Mason gave a small, almost apologetic smile. Back home, you learn little habits. You check the sky before rain. You notice where birds land. You remember which direction smoke travels. He looked toward the forest once more. Most of the time, those habits never matter. His expression grew thoughtful. The trick is that you never know which one will save your life until afterward. Lyra lowered her eyes to the biological scanner resting on the table. For years, she had believed evolution rewarded the strongest claws, the fastest reflexes, the deadliest venom. Yet none of those qualities explained the quiet man standing a few feet away. He possessed no extraordinary biology at all. He simply noticed the world before the world noticed him, and for the first time she wondered if that had been humanity's greatest adaptation all along. By the following morning, the expedition no longer moved the way it had on the first day. Nobody rushed ahead of Mason anymore. Nobody laughed when he paused to listen. Even Lieutenant Soren had slipped his tactical display into a side pouch instead of holding it in front of his face. The technology was still useful, but it was no longer leading them. Professor Lyra noticed something else had changed as well. The conversation sounded different. The younger researchers were no longer asking what their scanners detected. They were asking Mason what he noticed. He answered every question with surprising patience. "What are you looking at?" one student asked as Mason crouched beside the base of an enormous tree. "The moss." "Why?" "Because it grows thicker on the side that stays cooler." The student looked confused. "What does that tell you?" "Which direction keeps more moisture after sunrise?" Another researcher pointed toward the canopy. "And why does that matter?" Mason smiled. "Because the things living here probably know that too." Lyra listened quietly. None of these answers sounded dramatic. They sounded ordinary, almost disappointingly ordinary. Yet every hour that passed made them seem harder to argue with. Shortly before noon, the team reached a steep overlook where the forest stretched for miles in every direction. The missing expedition's intended research station could finally be seen through the trees nearly half a mile away. Its communications tower still stood upright above the canopy. Soren smiled with visible relief. "There it is." Several members of the team immediately started discussing the fastest route downhill. Mason remained completely still. "No." Everyone stopped. Lyra looked toward him. "What do you mean?" Mason pointed toward the distant station. "Do not walk straight there." Soren frowned. "It is only half a mile away." "Exactly. That is the shortest path." Mason nodded. "Which usually means it is the most obvious one." One of the engineers sighed. "Dr. Brooks, surely not every direct route is dangerous." Mason looked at him kindly. "Of course not." He pointed toward the valley below. "But if I wanted to watch everyone entering that station, where would I expect them to come from?" The engineer slowly followed his finger toward the open slope. Understanding appeared on his face before he spoke. "The shortest trail." Mason smiled. "Exactly." Lyra folded her arms. "Then what would you do?" Mason looked across the valley for nearly a minute without speaking. Finally, he pointed toward a winding ridge hidden behind thick evergreens. "We circle around. Stay above the station. Watch before we walk in." Soren checked the terrain map. "That adds almost an hour." Mason shrugged. "Maybe." Then he asked a question instead of giving another answer. "How many hours have we already lost because people assumed the shortest answer was the right one?" Nobody responded. There was nothing left to argue. The team quietly changed direction. As they followed the longer route, Lyra walked beside Mason instead of behind him. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Back at the academy, we classify apex predators by measurable biological advantages." Mason nodded. "Makes sense. Humans have almost none of those." "That is also true." She hesitated before continuing. "Then what made your species survive long enough to build civilizations?" Mason looked out across the endless forest before answering. "Probably the same thing that keeps us alive today." "Which is?" He smiled as though remembering someone from long ago. "My mother used to tell me something every time I left the house. She never said, 'Be the strongest.' She never said, 'Be fearless.' She always said, 'Pay attention.'" Mason adjusted the strap of his backpack and continued walking along the ridge. "Most people think survival belongs to whoever can fight the hardest." He glanced toward the quiet valley below. "Back home, we learned something different." Lyra looked at him curiously. "What?" Mason answered in the same calm voice he had carried since the day they met. "The world usually warns you before it hurts you. Most people are simply too busy talking to hear it." They reached the research station just before sunset by following the ridge instead of the obvious trail. From above, everything looked untouched. Solar panels still tracked the fading light. The communications tower stood straight against the gray sky. Nothing suggested panic. Nothing suggested disaster. Mason raised one hand, asking everyone to stay where they were. For nearly a full minute, he simply watched. Then he smiled for the first time that day. "There." Lyra narrowed her eyes. "What do you see?" Mason pointed toward a small patch of grass beside the station. "Movement." Soren lifted a pair of field binoculars. At first he saw nothing. Then a figure slowly stepped from behind one of the storage buildings. A woman wearing a faded expedition jacket cautiously looked around before raising both hands. Seconds later, two more researchers emerged from hiding beneath the station. Thin, exhausted, frightened, but alive. Relief swept through the entire team. As they carefully approached, the expedition leader, Dr. Helen Mercer, looked directly at Mason. "You did not come up the main trail." Mason shook his head. "No." Helen let out a long breath. "Then you listened?" Lyra stared in confusion. "What happened here?" Helen looked around the quiet forest before answering. "The first week we trusted our instruments more than this place. Every day they told us everything was normal. But the forest kept changing. Birds stopped singing. Animals avoided certain valleys. The wind carried strange scents. We ignored all of it because none of our equipment considered those things important." She looked toward Mason. "He figured it out, did not he?" Lyra slowly nodded. Helen smiled weakly. "Eventually, we realized the safest choice was to become quieter than our technology. We shut everything down and waited. The moment we stopped forcing the world to fit our models, we finally started understanding it." During the journey home, Professor Lyra barely touched her tablet. Instead, she filled an old paper notebook with observations she had never imagined writing. Listen before measuring. Watch before explaining. Patterns matter more than assumptions. Weeks later, the Grand Academy of Xenobiology held another lecture inside the same enormous auditorium where the story had begun. Once again, hundreds of students filled every seat. Once again, a hologram of a human appeared above the stage. But this time the slide looked very different. The old classification had disappeared. Professor Lyra stood quietly before the audience, then spoke the words that none of her students expected to hear. "Everything I taught you about this species was incomplete." The room became perfectly still. She touched the display, and every chart comparing claws, venom, muscle density, and natural weapons vanished. In their place appeared a single photograph of Mason Brooks sitting outside a small cabin on Earth with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise. "We searched for what humans had," she said softly. "We should have been asking what they noticed." One student slowly raised a hand. "Professor, if humans possess almost no natural weapons, why does the galaxy still consider them among its most capable survivors?" Lyra smiled. It was the same question she had once answered with complete confidence. Now her answer was entirely different. Because they learned that survival is not won by the creature with the sharpest claws. She paused, remembering the quiet forest, the returning birds, and the ordinary man who never tried to impress anyone. It belongs to the one who keeps learning after everyone else believes the lesson is finished. Far away on Earth, Mason Brooks had no idea his name was being discussed across the galaxy. He sat on the wooden porch outside his home, listening to birds singing through the morning trees while a mug of fresh coffee warmed his hands. To him, it was simply another peaceful day. To the rest of the galaxy, it had become the moment they finally understood that humanity's greatest adaptation had never been hidden in its body. It had always lived in its willingness to pay attention, to stay humble enough to keep learning, and to treat every new day as another chance to understand the world instead of trying to conquer it.